Chapter 14. This is insane, Tabitha said as she shook her head. I've never in my life heard of a plot like this. Can't possibly be real. It's terrible, but it's highly sophisticated. The cipher finished her sentence. But let's look at it this way. By the grace of the moon goddess, you killed Wenderoth in the obsidian temple. No other questing knight had been able to succeed at that task, and yet you wiped him out. If it wasn't for you, Hank, we wouldn't even have this information in the first place. I see the moon goddess hand in this, and I think she chose you and us because we're the only ones who were likely to believe that such a crazy idea was even. Sybil placed her hand over mine and gave me a light squeeze. She did choose you, Sybil reminded me. This is probably why. Okay, I said and took a deep breath. We just have to get to the lake before the king starts the ritual. When is that supposed to happen? I know the procession has already started, Sybil said, but Tabitha didn't. You say that it usually took a long time to get there. Tabitha's ears perked up, and she ran her fingers through her hair. Well, yes, she said, but we've lost some time on this quest. The moon ritual itself falls on the full moon, which is in 2 days, the cipher said when the blonde started to count on her fingers. Well, that gives us plenty of time, right? I asked. I had become accustomed to traveling at super speed and was beginning to lose my perception of space and time altogether. It's on the other side of the kingdom, Tabitha said. Maybe if we had the jeep. Sybil sighed. Well, the cipher said, you managed to find that wasabi and bergamot pretty quickly, and I have absolutely no idea how. It's a long journey, but for some reason, I believe in your abilities. I smiled because I knew that we would kill it even if the destination was at the far end of the known world. The moon goddess had been on my side for all my missions so far, and I doubted that she would fail me now. I guess we should get our things together then, Sybil sighed. We've got a long journey ahead of us. I need to plot out a route, Tabitha said. I want to make sure that this is my most efficient one yet. I remembered that there was about half of the bottle of speed juice left. That bottle had served us well for all of these journeys so far, but all I could was hope there was enough left to get us to wherever Lake Wahaya was. If you like, the cipher said to Sybil, you can have a look at some of my books while you wait for Tabitha to find the perfect route. I'm sure there's some spells and some alchemy in there that'll surprise and interest you. You might even find something to help you reach the lake faster. That would be wonderful, the witch replied as she set her basket down and wandered over to the bookshelves. I looked over at the cipher, who was flicking through Wenderoth's notebook and muttering to himself. Hey, I said, you've helped us tremendously. We wouldn't have been able to do it without you. Oh, he said and waved his hand. No need to thank me. It's my job, But then he stopped and stared into the distance. You okay? I asked. Yeah, he said slowly. Well, I don't know. All the effort you put into helping other people woke something up in me, you know? Doing this isn't my job anymore, but it sure as hell used to be. I know that I abandoned that life because of all the politics, but it felt good to be handed something that was really important for once. Something with a deadline on it that really mattered to someone. I don't miss life in the palace, dressing up every day and having to intercept dodgy communications between nobles and all that. But I miss doing something that feels important, you know? I smiled at the cipher. Yeah, I said. I fully understand that. We talked for a few more minutes while Sybil flipped through one of the books, and Tabitha jabbed at the map. I wanted to offer to help the women, but I didn't think either one really wanted me to butt into their affairs right then. Spells and maps were their specialties, and I was happy to leave them to. All right, Tabitha eventually said. I think I have something. She made her way over to the desk and spread out the map. I saw that she'd plotted out a very long route, one that ran all the way through Yerrick to the Forest of Thoth, and out the other end into a mountainous lake territory. Oh geez, Sybil muttered under her breath. My butt's going to be sore for sure. Yep, Tabitha nodded. But we can almost do a straight shot. It'll be long. Sure, and we'll have to find a place to sleep for the night. But I think we can make it before the king heads into the lake. The cipher's eyes widened. He said. Do you really think you can do that run within 2 days? Time? And you'll still have to convince the guards to let you speak to the king. I looked at the girls and shrugged. Sybil, I said with a smile, you might as well just tell him. The cipher eyed Sybil, who shot a look at me. Oh fine, she said. Hank, show him the bottle. I rummaged through my sack and pulled out the corked green bottle. I set my sack on the ground, and the cipher eyed the mysterious solution in my hands. Don't tell me, the cipher said with a smile. That stuff can make you run? Oh yeah, I said and nodded. With this stuff I can really run. The cipher glanced at Sybil and then back at the bottle. Mind if I take a sniff? He asked. Of course, she said. But bear in mind, I'm not as experienced an alchemist as you are. I've been through a lot of trials to create this, but this is the one that worked the best. I'm sure it'll be very impressive, he replied. The cipher took the bottle from my hand, held it up to the light to study it for a moment, and then uncorked it so he could take a deep smell of the solution. It was rather impressive since I could barely take the cork out of the bottle without wanting to puke my guts out. This is amazing, he said, shook his head and then leaned in for another sniff. Is your nose, Tabitha hesitated. Is your nose lined with steel or something? The cipher threw his head back and laughed. You get better at ignoring the side effects of foul-smelling liquids when you're dealing with alchemy all day, he said. You can pick apart the profile like you would a fine wine. And let me guess, the basis for this seems to be incredibly high-quality moonbeans. Yes, Sybil replied. The moonbeans are from our estate. Oh really? The cipher commented as he took another sniff. What else is in it? Tabitha asked. I want to know why it smells that way. And why it works. Well, to know why it works would take years of study, the cipher laughed. I'm sure Sybil can explain it to you sometime, but I'm getting hints of some odd mixtures. Are there crushed clamshells in here? Yes, Sybil admitted as she blushed. Crushed clamshells? Tabitha asked. What, are you trying to kill us? Don't worry, the cipher said. None of this is deadly. Actually, some of it might be in large quantities, but it's all quite safe in such a small dose. I'm getting hints of a rare plant that smells like it originates near the equator. Where did you acquire such a thing? I take great care to collect seeds wherever I go, Sybil said shyly. It's one of the things my mother taught me. The cipher corked the bottle and handed it back to me. A very important lesson, the cipher said. But you'd be amazed how many witches fail to learn that. Well, I guess you'll be heading off to Lake Wahaya. Now, if you don't mind leaving the notebook with me, there are some other passages I'd like to study some more. Winderoth had some notes about the history of vampires that might prove useful. Just be careful, I advised. Someone already tried to steal it from my estate. I may be an old man, but only a fool would dare attack a wizard in his domain, he said with a grin. But yes, I'll take some extra precautions, though I don't think anyone will find it out here, unless they followed you. I don't think anyone followed us, I said, but better safe than sorry. The cipher nodded in agreement and looked expectantly at me, which I took as a not so subtle hint that we should leave. I started to put the vial back in my sack when my hand brushed against the cloth that I'd wrapped around the opal dagger. Actually, I said, there is one other thing you can help us with. You may know the answer, or you may be able to find it in Winderoth's notebook. Oh, of course, he replied as he blinked in surprise. I carefully removed the cloth-wrapped dagger, and then slowly unwrapped it, until the silver blade shone in my hands. I'd forgotten just how detailed and luminescent it was. It was beautiful, made of moon silver with a detailed curling handle and a very slender edge. The most magnificent part of the dagger was obviously the opal. It looked like a smaller version of the moon, and it glinted in a rainbow of colors in the sunlight streaming through the cipher's window. Now that is something, he muttered as he leaned in for a closer look. Very nice work. May I? The expression on his face reminded me of a kid on Christmas morning, and his hand already hovered over the blade like he knew I wouldn't say no. Of course, I said. He took the handle delicately and went up to the window, where he turned the dagger around in the rays of sun. Where on earth did you get this? He asked. The palace would never issue such a fine weapon to a questing knight. Winderoth, I replied. The notebook wasn't the only thing I picked up on that quest. This was in his stash of loot, too. The cipher nodded and placed the opal dagger back in the piece of cloth. You know, he said, opal has many magical qualities, some more powerful than any other element or precious stone in Lupercalia. That's what I've heard, I said. I know that it's highly deadly in combination with moon silver, but I didn't quite know why. It's not just deadly, he said as he shook his head. You can use this dagger to harness energy and protect yourself against certain dark energies. People will say it's venomous, but it's not venom that they're responding to. This weapon wasn't made to kill mere mortals. I looked back at Sybil and Tabitha, who were both paying close attention. What do you mean? Sybil asked. Doesn't it work on humans and wolves? Of course it will, the cipher said. In fact, it'll be the easiest kill of your life. That's why people think it's venomous, because it can kill a human just from a scratch. But it's not venom that does that. The magic is simply too strong for the human, or in some cases the wolf. It's an ideal weapon in a fight against vampires or other surly magical creatures, and that's really why someone would carry such a weapon. So it might come in handy against a zombie werewolf, I said. It might, the cipher agreed. But why did Wenderoth have it? Sybil asked. Why would he keep something that was so deadly to him? You keep salves and bombs that are deadly, the cipher pointed out. But that's different, Sybil replied. In very small doses they can be helpful. And I'd only use a deadly dose on evil creatures. So what if he was trying to protect himself against other magical creatures? Tabitha suggested. We always assume that the vampires are in league with all the dark monsters in Lupercalia. But what if he wanted to protect himself against them? A war among the monsters, the cipher mused. I'd say that was good for us, unless we get caught in the middle. I think he used it to kill other vampires, I said as I tried to remember what Wenderoth had told me. He said something about killing other vampires when they weren't useful anymore. The whole room went silent, and we all stared at the dagger. Either way, it's a very valuable weapon, Melchior said with a nod. Guard it carefully, and for the love of the goddess, don't let something like that get into the wrong hands. I nodded as I started to wrap the weapon in the cloth. I sighed when the glow was smothered again, but at least I had something else I could use against the werewolf in the lake. I looked at the rays of light streaming through the window and saw that they were becoming brighter and brighter. Soon it would be midday, and we had to get to Lake Wahaya before the king entered the water. Thanks again for everything, I said to the gangly cipher, who was leaning against one of his messy wooden ledges. It was my pleasure, Melchior replied. I didn't think it would be, but you have shown me some of the most interesting material I've seen in recent months. Go safely on your journey, and when you return I'll be able to tell you more about what I found in the journal. And thanks for showing me all of your alchemical work, Sybil said. It was really eye-opening. If you don't mind, I ripped out one of the pages of your book to do with hexes. The cipher's eye wobbled a bit, but he forced a smile. Of course that's all right, he said with a nervous laugh. That 400-year-old book needs some use. Tabitha held out her hand for the cipher to shake, and he diligently took it. They shook hands and she nodded. You've proven your worth, she said tersely and smiled. Now fly away, fly away, fly away all. The cipher snorted with laughter at his joke and then turned back to his desk. Since we'd clearly been dismissed again, we slipped out through the doors and back into the crisp, sunny day. The lake smelled refreshing and cool, and the breeze carried the scent of pine and lavender. You know, Sybil said, if this lake wasn't completely ridden with monsters, I'd almost want to go for a swim. I could use a cool down after all that horrible news, Tabitha sighed. But we have a mission now. We have to save the king, and until that's done we don't have time for a dip in the lake. And we know what that means, I said. Time to take another swig of the magic speed juice. I rifled through my sack and pulled out the bottle. I was going to have to take a pretty sizable gulp this time because time was of the essence, and this was one of the longest runs yet. Sorry again about the taste, Sybil said and turned pink. I guess what the cipher said was right. Sometimes you get so caught up putting materials together that you don't pay attention to how bad they taste. That's okay, I said. This potion has served us too well for me to resent the flavor. But it might be nice if you can come up with a formula that's easier to swallow once we're back at the estate. Then I can try it too, Tabitha said. Why would you possibly need to run anywhere? Sybil asked as she arched an eyebrow. You never run unless you absolutely have to, and even then you'd rather let Hank do all the work. Oh, I don't know, Tabitha replied haughtily. Maybe I can map out every route in the entire kingdom or something. Or maybe I'd hit the sales rack at that store Ava told us about. The one she said was a department store. Neiman Marcus, I said. Well, there's a lot of them, but I know that's one of her favorites. Okay, here goes. I popped the cork and held my nose. This was the last big run, and I decided to drink about a third of what was left in the bottle. I threw my head back and let the disgusting liquid slide down my throat and into my stomach. That was quick, Sybil murmured. It was time to become a machine as I felt the liquid spread from the base of my stomach throughout my whole body like I was being lit on fire. The sensation kind of reminded me of an orgasm. When this stuff kicked in, I had to go just so I didn't spontaneously combust from all the energy that had accumulated in my body. I looked around and the details of our environment became clearer. Suddenly, it was like I could see every leaf in every tree and every ripple on the lake. I hadn't really noticed this side effect of the potion before because I'd had such a burning desire to run, but it was definitely something that could be useful. I'd have to ask Sybil if she could come up with a formula that would just amplify my senses, but first I had to move before I burned up in my own skin. I pounced forward into my great wolf form. I felt my body realign and lengthen, and I instantly felt more powerful. Man, I love being a werewolf. The breeze from the lake blew through my fur as the girls hopped on my back. All right, Tabitha said. Remember what I said. It's a pretty straight shot. Along this route, we're going northwest through Yerrick, then into Thoth, and straight on until we hit the mountains. We probably won't be able to do the whole journey today, but that's the plan. I pawed at the sandy ground and nodded so that Tabitha knew I understood. It was odd not being able to speak, but it felt natural in my great wolf form to find other ways to communicate. Then I shot off. I ran down the shore of the lake toward the secret path. Water splashed around me as I sped across the rocks and puddles, and despite my speed, I never felt like I would lose my footing on the slippery surface. If anything, I was moving too fast for that to happen. The shoreline came and went as I crashed into the woods, and a few moments later, the scent of lavender nearly overwhelmed me. I actually sneezed a couple of times, but it wasn't enough to slow me down. This must be near the purple distraction, I heard Sybil shout to Tabitha. We're slightly east of the purple distraction, Tabitha shouted back. But at least we get to enjoy the smell. The hard, sandy ground started to become smoother and softer, and the smell of the forest changed from the coniferous pine trees to moist, warm soil. It meant we were near the forest of Yerrick even though mere minutes had passed. I was practically a speed machine. I had no idea how fast I was running, but I was willing to bet that it was close to 100 miles an hour. I was amazed that the girls managed to stay on top of me while I was running so fast, but I knew that they could adapt to anything. I dashed over the mossy ground and entered the soft, moist forest of Yerrick. The mulch was a welcome relief to the harder ground I'd covered already, and I briefly wondered what my hands and feet would look like after all the running was done. I had never run this much in my life, and as much fun as it was, I didn't think I could keep it up forever, even with Sybil's speed juice. I was definitely going to need to start training Casanova to help with some of these trips. But at least the stretch through Yerrick was pleasant, and we glided effortlessly through the woods for what must have been hours. Occasionally, Tabitha tugged slightly on either ear, and I would veer that direction to stay on track. At some point, the smell of the forest started to change. The ground became more brittle, and there were more fallen trees on the ground. We're in the forest of Thoth, Sybil shouted. I know this place like the back of my hand. It's also the place where I met Hank. So much of my life would be different if it wasn't for that day. Not only did I meet Sybil for the first time, but it was also the first day that I had killed a man. Lupercalia had offered me so many firsts that I could barely keep track. The cold, fresh smell of water filled my nose, and I remembered the stream where we had stopped. It soon came into view, and I felt the girls lean down so they wouldn't get too wet. Well, it was time for another surprise. Instead of running through the shallow stream, I lifted my front paws off the ground and sprung forward with my hind legs. I leaped over the stream and landed back on the other side. Holy crap, Tabitha exclaimed. That was so graceful. It felt like we were flying for a second. You should be a show horse, Sybil laughed. You nailed that jump even better than some of the horses I've seen train for years. I looked up to the sky while I was running and saw that the sun was beginning to burn a bright orange. This meant that sundown would be coming in a few Hours. It was go time. I doubled down and pounded the ground beneath me. We flew through Thoth until I reached an area with fewer trees and lots of red flowers growing underfoot. I saw tall grasses ahead of me, and the trees all but disappeared. We're almost out of Thoth, Sybil shouted. It's tall grasses and wheat fields from now until we get to the mountainous region. I pounded through the last of the forest and straight into the tall grasses. Suddenly I was surrounded by tall green blades, and I couldn't see a single damn thing around me. It was like I walked into a maze and I slowed down for a moment while I tried to figure out if I was still heading in the right direction. Don't worry, Tabitha shouted. The map said that this terrain should stop soon. There's a mile or so of long grass, and then we'll be back on more solid ground. Sybil and I will keep an eye on the sun to make sure we're still heading in the right direction. So I picked up the pace again until the grassy plain was nothing but a blurry green ocean. Blades brushed against my body and fell away as I sped across the ground. Small rodents ducked back into their holes and a flutter of butterflies ducked out of my path. I was steaming across the grasslands like a train, and I felt just as powerful. I could smell the end of the grasslands before I could see it. My nose picked up the scent of wheat in the air, and I could hear a cow mooing somewhere ahead. There was a brief moment where I was crossing a recently turned field, and then I was caught in another maze as we entered the wheat field. But a moment later I found a path that the farmer used, and I turned onto that so I would have a better idea of where I was going. I peered up into the sky, which was a deep bright blue. The sun had started to set, and the light became dusty and romantic. If we hadn't been on a mission, it would have been the perfect evening to sit outside on the estate and drink a nice cold tankard of mead. Despite my extra speed, I was in a race against the sun. I wanted to get as close to the lake as I could, though I really had no idea how close we were. There was nothing familiar about this run, but it was picturesque as hell. I was learning more about the geography of Lupercalia from this mission alone than I had from all the maps that Tabitha had shown me in her collection. One thing the maps hadn't really conveyed was just how large the wheat fields were. We were still among the golden stalks when darkness finally fell. My limbs were tired, and the effects of the speed juice were starting to wear off. I could still run fast, but nothing like I could with the speed potion. When I could barely see my paws in front of me, I slowed down to a canter and then a trot. I finally stopped altogether in the middle of a large, sprawling wheat field. It was time for us to regroup, and more importantly, I needed to rest and recover so I could make the rest of the journey in the morning. The girls finally seemed to understand that I was done for the day, and the pair rolled off my back. Sybil gave me a sympathetic pat and then stood back up as I rose up on my hind legs. I was so tired that I wasn't sure I could shift back to human form. I wondered what it would be like to spend the night as a direwolf, but I could see the concern in the girl's eyes. I forced myself to picture human Hank, and after the weird sensation of being pulled and reshaped, I opened my eyes to find I was back in my original form. My God, I panted, and my legs buckled from exhaustion. My arms and legs are sore as hell. Don't worry, Sybil said. I have some balm for that. But first we need to figure out what our plan is for tonight. I don't see anything nearby. Tabitha put her satchel on the ground and rooted around for the map. She stood up and unraveled it, but her eyebrow was furrowed with focus. The expression on her face as she checked our position led me to believe that we might not be all that close to an inn or even a farmhouse. Okay, she said. So there's good news and bad news. Which one do you want first? Good, I sighed. Bad, Sybil said at the same time, and just as I did so, Sybil and I looked at each other and I shrugged. Let's do good, Sybil said. I trust Hank's judgment as the leader of this quest. Thanks, I laughed. Glad we figured that one out, Tabitha replied. Anyway, the good news is that we're over 2/3 of the way there, which is totally not what I was expecting from today's run. Thanks for believing in me, I said with a laugh. Sorry, Hank, Tabitha replied, and I saw her blush in the silver light. Now what's the bad news? Sybil asked. And just how bad is it? Well, Tabitha started and waved her hands around in the air. Look around. It's nightfall, and we're in the middle of a field of wheat with nowhere to go. The wheat swayed gracefully in the night breeze. It was picturesque, sure, but there wasn't a soul in sight. If this quest wasn't so last minute, we could have packed some camping gear. Sybil sighed. How I love sleeping under the stars. We used to do it all the time in my family when I was a little kid. I can't think of a single thing worse than sleeping outside, Tabitha said, dryly and bristled. So you can understand why this situation is beginning to stress me out somewhat. I guess you're right, Sybil said and nodded. Also, we were very familiar with the woods we slept in. I'm not so sure about these parts. There could be creatures we don't know about that come down from the mountains. Exactly, Tabitha said and looked around. There are things in the mountains that could easily find us in such an exposed location. Luckily, I knew that no mountain beasts were going to feast on us tonight. The situation was inconvenient, sure, but I was a man with a master plan. Well, really just a magic ring that could literally take us to our brand new sprawling mansion in New Jersey. Hey guys, I said. I think you're forgetting about something. Sybil looked up at me and raised an eyebrow. Even though it had practically turned pitch black outside, I could still see the glimmer of her sparkling green eyes. What? Tabitha asked. I'm exhausted. I can't think of anything right now. Well, I laughed. What if I told you that we can stay somewhere with all the best technology and amenities of the modern world within seconds? I sounded like an advertisement from the 50s, but I brought my left hand up in the air and wiggled my pinky finger. The magic ring glittered in the darkness. Anyone up for a little trip back to Jersey? Chapter 15. Tabitha's shoulders dropped, and she made a loud huffing noise. Of course, she sighed and shook her head. I'm so stupid. Hank, I'm such a dumb squire that you should fire me. Oh, don't be silly, Sybil laughed. I was too caught up in everything happening here in Lupercalia that I forgot as well. Forget what I said about camping, this is way better. I put my hands on my hips so that the girls could loop their arms through mine. Tabitha came over first and threaded her right arm in my left and gave me a sweet peck on the cheek. You're a genius, you know, the blonde purred and her soft brown eyes glowed in the darkness. Sybil took my right arm in her left, also gave me a kiss on the cheek, and then it was time to go. I twisted the ring on my left hand. We were already practically in pitch black, so I barely noticed Lupercalia disappearing around me. Instead, it was the feeling of my insides stretching out and being squeezed that let me know we were traveling through time and space. I felt like I'd been flying the whole time I was running through the woods, but whenever I traveled between worlds, it was more like I was free-falling. I felt the ground materialize underneath me and became aware of my weight. Again, I looked around and we were back in Jersey. However, instead of being in our sprawling mansion as I'd envisioned, we were in my little house near Main Street. Ah, Tabitha purred in her low, scratchy voice. This is not the new house. Nope, I sighed. But this is where we left from last time. I forgot that detail. Well, what should we do? Sybil asked. I don't mind staying here if you're too tired, but it'd be such a waste when there's that big, beautiful mansion just 15 minutes away, practically waiting for us to sleep in it, Tabitha added. Don't worry, girls, I snickered. I'll drive us all to the new place. That way we'll arrive there next time we travel with the ring, so it's actually more convenient. Right? Tabitha asked. I also thought it was a truly excellent idea. Oh, admit it, the witch laughed. You just want to go to the fancy house. Nothing wrong with the fancy house, I said with a shrug. Exactly, Tabitha laughed. There's nothing wrong with appreciating the finer things in life. Sybil shook her head and muttered something to herself, but I was too tired to care. All I wanted to do was climb into my giant bed, so I found my phone, my car keys, and all the assorted keys and remotes for the new place and headed for the front door. I always feel so silly wearing armor in this house, Tabitha said as we passed the mirror in the hallway. I look completely out of place. I joined her in front of the mirror and took a look at myself too. My armor still looked freshly polished, and my hair was windswept from our time in the wheat fields. Since becoming a knight, though, I had gradually become more chiseled. My cheekbones were more prominent and I had a strong masculine chin covered in dark stubble. My blue eyes glowed in the dim hallway and I thought I looked pretty damn good for a guy who just run almost the entire length of Lupercalia. Come on, guys, Sybil said with a yawn. You can admire yourselves all you want at the new place, but I want to go to bed. You know it's only just nightfall, right? I laughed. Yeah, but we'll be up at dawn, Sybil replied. Plus we need all the rest we can get on a mission like this. True, I said. Sybil opened the front door, and we piled out of the house. It may have been pitch black in Lupercalia, but my suburban street was bathed in an orange glow from the street lamps. There were also lights on in houses, and an occasional car with headlights would drive down the road. These were the small things that I noticed more and more now that I spent so much time in Lupercalia. It felt good to sit down in the driver's seat, and I let myself relax for a moment before I turned the ignition. It was only when I revved the engine that the girls finally climbed inside, and they both sat in back. "Oh, come on," I laughed. "First you ride on my back all day, and now I'm the chauffeur again." Sybil just yawned in response, while Tabitha leaned close to my ear and gave it a brief kiss. "You're the best, Hank," she said. "You're everything a girl could ask for." "I like this flattery," I responded. I gave the noblewoman my most devilish grin, and she blushed in response as she leaned back comfortably into Sybil's shoulder. "To the manor, chauffeur," Tabitha teased. I backed out of the driveway and headed for the highway. I could feel sleep tugging at my brain, and so making good time to the new house became the priority. I rolled down my window so the cool wind and the rush of the other cars would help keep me focused on the road in front of me. Pennington Drive seemed to loom out of the darkness once we left the highway, and I nearly missed the turn. I made a mental note to see about placing a light near the rock and then headed up the very dark and somewhat spooky private road. When we neared the gate, though, a light came on that illuminated the wrought iron, and beyond that, a line of small lights flickered to life to light the way to the house. "Whoa," Sybil murmured. "Automatic lights," I said. "This house really is full of surprises." The gate started to open almost as soon as I pressed the button, and I followed the lights all the way to the front door. Once again I was so anxious to get inside that I decided to leave the Jeep parked out front. Driving around in armor at night turned out to be a not-so-good idea, and I was ready to peel off the stiff metal. I managed to get the key in without any problems, and the door swung open easily like it had just been oiled. I took a moment to soak in the spectacular setting once again, and then I went to find the control panel. "All right," I muttered to myself. "Main lights, here we go." The icon labeled main lights appeared on the screen, so I pressed that and then used the scale to light the room without blinding anyone. "Beautiful," Sybil sighed as she walked toward the glass wall. "It's like magic." "The magic of electricity," I said and nodded. "It's no necromancy, but it's enough for me." "Well, I've certainly had enough magic for one day," Tabitha said. "I'm going to take my armor off and get to sleep. We have another long day ahead of us tomorrow, and I'm already exhausted as it is." The noblewoman started patting up the elegant wooden staircase and turned right on the landing. "She's a woman who knows what she wants, I'll give her that," I laughed. "Tabitha always wants a nap," Sybil yawned and then smiled up at me like a sleepy child. "Looks like she isn't the only one," I replied. "I guess I am pretty tired," Sybil said. "I might just go join her." "Aren't you coming to bed? You've been running all day. I thought that you'd be more tired than us." All we did was ride. I had gotten so used to running that I wasn't mentally prepared to rest. But the idea of taking off my armor and lying in bed with my women was pretty damn enticing. "Bed does sound pretty good," I said. I ran my right hand through her silky black hair, and she closed her eyes as she leaned into my hand like a cat being stroked. "Okay," she said with a smile and held my hand in hers. "I wouldn't mind snuggling under the sheets." We held hands and walked up the elegant staircase together. We stopped about halfway up, and I pointed to the weird Calder mobile which swayed ever so slightly in the breeze from the AC. "I wonder what he was thinking when he made that," I said. "No idea," Sybil said as she yawned. "I've never seen anything like it before. I have to take you guys to some museums in New York," I said as we started up the steps again. "I'm sure you'll love some of the odd things they have on display." "That sounds like fun," Sybil replied. "Maybe we can treat ourselves to a couple of days in the city after we finish this quest." "Ah," I laughed. "That does sound nice. We could get a hotel room, go to some nice restaurants, maybe see a show, and go shopping," Sybil added. "Of course," I agreed. "We'll do lots of shopping." Tabitha had already made herself comfortable in the luxurious king-sized bed. By the time we stepped into the room, she'd fallen asleep with the lights on, and her armor and clothing were in a pile by the bed. "Okay, I'm so ready to get out of this armor," I said as I started to peel off The arm pieces. Isn't your squire supposed to help with that? Sybil asked with a laugh. If you can wake her up then please do so, I replied as I unfastened the breastplate. I've certainly never had much luck with that. As much as I loved wearing my armor, it felt good to take it off, especially if I'd had to wear it all day. It felt like I'd finished doing an honest day's work, and the aches and pains were just reminders of all the good I had done. At least my shirt and pants came off easily enough, and as I looked at the bed I had this sudden urge to throw myself on top of it. I grinned at Sybil, and then threw myself into the middle of the bed. Tabitha must have sensed my approach, even in the depths of one of her deep sleeps, because I saw her eyelids flicker open, and a moment later she squealed and scooted toward the edge of the bed just before I landed right in the middle of the mattress. I'm so sorry for waking you, I laughed. I couldn't help myself. The bed looked so comfortable, and you wanted to terrify me out of my sleep? The noblewoman croaked. I looked over at Sybil, who was bent over in a fit of laughter. You've only been up here for what? I asked. 5 minutes. Enough time to fall asleep. She yawned and rolled onto her side. Sybil pulled her long green dress over her head and set it on the floor. I think I'm going to opt for a more graceful landing, Sybil said, and she crawled into bed and curled up next to me on the other side. I spotted a light switch just above one of the bedside tables, so I reached over and flicked it. The room was instantly swallowed in darkness, and I felt both girls nestle closer to me. Wow, I said. Now that is some really good design work. Huh. Sybil muttered sleepily. Nothing, I laughed. I sank into the memory foam mattress and let its perfect comfort pull me down. Tomorrow was going to be a big day, but at least we would all be well rested. And this was certainly the best camping trip I had ever been on. Sybil sleepily cast her arm over my chest, and she rested her soft cheek in the space between my shoulders and my neck. Her herb-heavy scent filled my nose, and I took a deep breath before I closed my eyes. I felt the world drift away as I fell into a deep, well-deserved sleep. Suddenly, I heard ocean waves crashing over me. I had been in such a deep sleep that it felt like the noise was dragging me out of the deep recesses of my consciousness. I hadn't had a single dream, and I hadn't stirred once. It was like I'd been woken from the dead. The sound of waves crashing continued, but I couldn't feel any water over me. I moved my hands and found that Sybil was still in my arms, whereas Tabitha squirmed awake next to me. What's that? Sybil said in a small voice as she nestled herself deeper into my chest and put a hand over her ear. It's a fancy alarm, silly, Tabitha said in a sing-song voice, and she flew off the bed and landed on the floor gracefully. The noblewoman pressed another light switch that lit up the room in a low glow. The sound of ocean waves grew louder and louder and crashed over the whole bedroom as the light grew brighter. What time is it? I asked around a yawn. And where is that noise coming from? It's almost 5 in the morning, Tabitha replied and flicked another switch. The sound of waves came to an abrupt stop, and I sat up in bed and rubbed my eyes. Was that an alarm? I asked. Yep, she said. I found another handy-dandy little screen in this room, and it even told me exactly what time the sun was going to rise. So I set our alarm for right before it did so I could get ready. Usually I wake up before dawn and then wake you up, but we were all in the same room, so you know. I don't want to be awake, Sybil groaned as she sat up. Come on, Sybil, Tabitha said in an official tone of voice. We have a kingdom to save. We went to bed early enough, didn't we? You should be ready to tackle the day ahead. We did go to bed early, I agreed and stifled another yawn. I could feel myself waking up and decided to ignore the fact that the sun was still rising. We had a long day ahead of us, and our glamping experience was over. It was time to return to Lupercalia and get back on the road, or rather, the wheat fields. I spotted my phone on the bedside table and decided to take a quick look before setting out on my day. The screen lit up and I was met with 20 missed calls and a single text message. Oh, I mumbled. What is it? Sybil asked as she peered over my shoulder. A message from Ava, I said as 3 words drifted over the screen, followed by many exclamation marks. Need more beans. She must be running low, the witch noted. People are drinking this stuff like crazy, I said as I typed in a reply. Not to worry. New bean delivery in a few days. Love, Hank. That's sweet, Sybil said, and then she leaned over and kissed me on the ear. All right, girls, I said. You have to remind me that the first thing we do After defeating this monster in the lake is ship over more beans. According to the spreadsheet I made, we should be good for another week or so, but Ava is starting to freak out a little bit. Well, luckily it's almost time for another bean harvest, Sybil said. She's probably worried because she still doesn't know where they come from or how long it takes to get it here. She probably thinks it takes weeks, Tabitha added. And we'll let her keep believing that for now, I said as I hopped out of the bed. After a few stretches to loosen my muscles, I pulled my clothes back on and then the armor. I immediately felt more powerful in my armor, and I felt my back straighten to conform to the silver breastplate. Even in my human form I knew I looked authoritative and strong in the armor, and pride welled in my chest as I realized I was ready to head out for another day of saving Lupercalia. Meanwhile, Sybil seemed to be locked in a battle with her simple dress. She floundered around the room in the billowing fabric as she tried to pull the gown over her head. Need any help? I asked with a smirk. The witch finally managed to pull her right arm through one of the sleeves and popped her head out of the top. Don't mind me, she yawned. I'll get there eventually. I looked over at Tabitha, who was already consulting her map. The blonde looked up at me and traced her eyes from the bottom of my boots to the top of my head. Even though I just gotten dressed, I felt like she was mentally removing my armor. You must like a man in uniform, I teased. You could say that, she purred. The noblewoman arched her neck slightly so that her pale, freckly skin was exposed and her plump, pink lips seemed to beckon at me. I doubted that any knight in Lupercalia had ever been joined by a squire this sexy. If we didn't have a mission to complete, I would have taken her right then and there. What are you thinking? I asked and placed my hands on my hips. Oh, I was just remembering how we made such great time yesterday, she said, and shook all the lustful thoughts out of her head. All thanks to you, of course. She smoothed down her white blonde hair and returned her gaze to the map. She frowned as she traced a finger across the page, and I could tell that her mind was already back in Lupercalia. How much longer do you think it will take us to reach the lake? I asked. It's hard to say for sure, she said, and she wrinkled her nose slightly in thought. As I said last night, we're over 2/3 of the way there, but we are heading into the mountains. The terrain will be rougher and you'll have to run uphill. I would say we have a few hours to go, but we should reach the lake before nightfall. Oh, a mountain run, Sybil exclaimed. That should be very beautiful. Oh, it is, Tabitha said and rolled the map back up again. I used to go there every autumn with my parents as a child, and it's truly something to behold. There's a reason the Lupercalian nobility gets so excited about the trek to the lake every year. If you thought the Cypher's Island was beautiful, wait until you see the mountains. I have no doubt it's lovely, I replied, just like everything else I've seen in the kingdom. But don't forget why we're going there. We can soak in the atmosphere after we've destroyed the vampire zombie werewolf. You're right, of course, Sybil said. So we should probably head back to the fields. Let's do a quick sweep of the downstairs and then get going, I said. Dawn's light had filled the house as I stepped into the hall, and everything seemed to have its own golden glow. Outside, birds tweeted in the trees. Leaves drifted slowly toward the ground, and dew glittered on the lawn like thousands of tiny diamonds. It was a spectacular sight, and I couldn't wait until we had a few free days to just bask in the glory of how beautiful our house was. We swept through the downstairs and made sure everything had been put away. The doors were locked and the alarm was set. When that was done, I checked that my sack had everything I needed and then looked at the girls. Do we have everything? I asked. I'm all set, Sybil said with a smile. Me too, Tabitha nodded. Today's going to be big. I can feel it. I felt the anticipation rise in my stomach. This was our biggest quest yet. And the king didn't even know a thing about it. It had been nothing but a gut feeling that there was more to the diary than a few rambling entries, and I'd been right. Now I just had to convince the king and his guards just how dangerous the situation really was. Time to kick this monster's ass, I said as I held out my arms for the girls. Once the girls had looped their arms through mine, I twisted the ring on my left finger, and the beautiful house disappeared from my vision. For a moment, I plummeted through time and space, unaware of anything, even the girls who were next to me. I couldn't feel the armor on my body or the sack strung over my shoulder, and it wasn't until the ground reappeared under us that I became aware of my weight and my size again. We were back in the wheat fields. The stalk stretched out for miles before me, and the dusty morning light illuminated everything in a kind of haze. I could hear crickets singing around me, and I even brushed up against the dew on a stalk of wheat. How beautiful it is in the morning, Sybil said. It was hard to see much last night. Beautiful, yes, Tabitha nodded. But I'm glad we didn't spend the night. The land near the mountains is a completely different place at night than it is in the day. I can imagine. I sighed as I reached down into my bag and grasped the bottle of foul-smelling speed juice. That's true of a lot of places. You know, Tabitha said, I could really use some moonbeam brew right about now. You want some of this? I asked with a laugh and gestured at the bottle of speed juice. No way, the blonde said and shook her head. You couldn't pay me to drink that stuff. Suit yourself, I said with a shrug. It was time to get back to work, so I uncorked the bottle, brought it to my lips and took a big confident swig. I could already feel the fire in my stomach by the time I popped the cork back in the bottle and shoved it back into my sack. The energy melted into my nerves and my bones, and made my senses sharper than ever. I felt like I was listening to each individual cricket singing its song. In the wheat field, I felt like I could discern every different stalk and decipher exactly what made it different from the one next to it. There was so much energy flowing through me that I leapt forward and did a somersault in my armor before popping up as the great wolf. My God, it felt good to be a dog again. Holy crap, Sybil exclaimed. Did you just do a somersault? That was great, Hank, Tabitha laughed. This stuff is turning you into a real gymnast. I bounced between my front paws and panted at the girls as a sign that I was revving to go and could barely contain myself any longer. I nearly howled for joy when Tabitha finally slung herself over my neck and clung onto me while Sybil took her place behind her and wrapped her arms around Tabitha's waist. Onward, Tabitha shouted with a laugh. I did as the noblewoman asked and sped forward through the fields of wheat. Just like before, the entire place became a blur to me. I felt like a bullet, cutting through everything with immense power and satisfaction. I cut through miles and miles of wheat until something caught my nose in the distance. It was a brook. Just ahead, I could see that the wheat fields ended. The ground beneath my paws was already becoming rockier, and I could hear the water as it flowed over the granite. The scent of the water made me feel thirsty, so when I was clear of the fields, I bounded through the valley until I found the brook. I stopped just long enough to plunge my head into the water, and then lap up some of the glittering liquid. It was the most refreshing water I'd ever tasted in my life. Good call, Hank, Tabitha said, and she hopped off my back. Sybil followed and removed an empty glass bottle from her basket. She dipped the glass bottle in the brook and filled it up with water. Did you know that there are healing minerals in the water in these mountains? Sybil asked and took a swig from her bottle. When the witch had drunk about half the bottle, she wiped her lips and then handed the rest to Tabitha. That's another reason the nobles like to come here, Tabitha said as she accepted the offer. There are health benefits in the mountain region that can't be found anywhere else in Lupercalia. Tabitha took a long sip and then handed the bottle back to Sybil. It's also really refreshing after a hard run, Sybil laughed as she refilled the bottle and placed it in her basket. I took one last lick of the water before lifting my head and shaking the excess off. I pawed the ground to let the girls know I was ready to go, and then I looked toward the mountains that were suddenly so much closer. It's a pretty straight shot right up the mountain from here, Tabitha said as she climbed back onto my back. We should be able to reach the village in no time. Sybil climbed on after her, and I took a moment to take stock of the mountain region before me. There were more trees and the path we were on was well worn, so it was smooth rather than rocky. If it stayed like that, we'd be to Lake Wahaya in no time. As we entered the forest that ran along the mountainside, it was hard not to slow down just a bit to admire the scenery. It really was one of the most stunning places I'd been in Lupercalia, which was saying something. Incredibly tall conifers clung to the rocky ground, while smaller but more colorful trees filled in the space between the giants. There were trees with bright red leaves and golden trunks, and others with dark green leaves and white bark that was slowly peeling away. Bushes full of berries sprawled across the ground, and wildflowers sprang up through every crack and crevice in the rocks. The air also started to feel different the higher up we got. Even though the Air everywhere in Lupercalia felt very clean and untouched by technology or fossil fuels. This air was something different. I felt a wave of calm wash over me, like something was cleaning my insides, and I figured it was the high altitude thin air. Look, Tabitha exclaimed when we reached a clearing. She bent down and pointed in the distance at a blue flag rising out of the forest. Is that it? Sybil asked in an excited voice. Uh-huh, Tabitha replied. Smell that mountain air. That's the lake. I started to race toward the flags, and as we drew closer I could see the blue, silver, and white flags that normally flew over the palace. It meant the king had already arrived, but it looked like we were in time to stop the attack. We did it, Tabitha laughed. And it's not even lunchtime. Hank, you did it. As I ran at what felt like 100 miles an hour, I felt the sweet relief of success. There was still an entire afternoon ahead of us to stop the vampires' plot, and I was feeling completely indestructible. We'd done it. We'd reached the village of Lake Wahaya in time to save the king and preserve Lupercalia. Chapter 16. It soon became clear that flags had been placed around the entire village. The whole place looked like it was wrapped in chiffon, and I wondered if Sebastian and the rest of the squires had been sent ahead a day or two early just to get the place ready. When we cleared the forest, I had my first real look at the town. It was like a Renaissance fair, but without the folks in shorts and t-shirts, the weird, historically accurate candy, or the guy talking on his cell phone while his girlfriend pretended to be interested in a glass-making demonstration. There were cobblestone streets as well, just like the other towns I'd visited in Lupercalia. However, unlike the roads through the farming villages that were covered in muck, this one had glistening gray stones that looked like they'd been freshly polished. Whoa, Sybil said in amazement as I padded toward the town. The whole place is so clean. Uh-huh, Tabitha replied. They spend practically all year preparing for the king's visit. It's sacred ground, so they take care of it accordingly. It also doesn't hurt that most of the townspeople are either craftsmen or fishermen. There isn't as much debris as you would find in places where there's a lot of farming or raising animals. I do love stock, of course, Sybil started, but I have to admit that a fishing town smells a whole lot better than a town with sheep and pigs. You should be here after the catch has been brought in, Tabitha laughed. It's not quite so charming then, but they don't fish while the king is here. At least not on a large scale. We were close enough by that point that I could see market stalls selling fish, as well as stalls with small artistic wares. Most of the knickknacks looked like wood-carved figurines of the king, but there were also plenty of animals, and a few dolls in the mix. Small noble children ran around in little blue robes while their parents greeted each other. The taverns were full, and on such a beautiful day, many people were sitting outside while they breathed in the cleansing air and drank the local mead. They had no idea how much danger they were in. I stopped at the edge of the town so that I could shift back to my hybrid state. It was the form that would guarantee us entry into the town, and if I was lucky, maybe get me in to see the king. But more importantly, it was the form I would need for the upcoming battle. I guess this is where we get off, Sybil said, and I felt both girls slide off. My goodness, Tabitha said and stretched her back out. That feels good after a long ride. Truly, Sybil agreed. I was beginning to get a little bit saddle sore. Who knows if I'll be able to walk tomorrow after all this riding we've been doing. I found their reaction pretty funny because they hadn't even been doing any of the work. I suddenly had a newfound respect for horses and all they put up with from people, and I told myself I'd make sure to give all the horses on the estate some extra carrots and oats. Then I rose up on my hind legs and felt myself grow into my 9-foot-tall werewolf self. It had been a little longer than usual since I was in my hybrid form, and it felt really good to be back in it. I towered over the girls and could see even further than before into the town of Wahaya. I felt instantly more powerful, and I growled as the energy from the transformation coursed through me. Oh, Sybil cooed as she blushed a deep pink and swiped her dark silky hair behind her cheek. What is it? I laughed gruffly. Oh, nothing. She huffed and fluttered her eyelashes. I haven't seen you in your hybrid form for a few days. I forgot just how tall you were. I placed my hand on her head and laughed to myself while Tabitha looked back at us and playfully rolled her eyes. Come on, gang, the noblewoman laughed. We have a quest to complete. Anywhere else in the galaxy we probably would have drawn plenty of stares. But in the middle of Lupercalia, a werewolf and his companions barely drew more than a polite nod. Many of the other nobles were also in hybrid form and, while we weren't dressed in blue and white, no one seemed to care enough to comment on our attire, though the free-flowing mead might have played a part in that as well. "Hank," I heard a squeaky voice say. I looked around for a second before realizing who it was, and then I looked down at the ground. "Sebastian," I laughed. "How are you?" Sebastian was dressed in a checkered blue and white jumpsuit and a hat with a bell at the end. He was quite literally dressed like a court jester, which I thought didn't even exist in Lupercalia. "Will you be joining us for the banquet tonight?" the small squire asked. "We will be having the most elaborate fish courses, and the squires are all putting on a pantomime. As you can see, I'm a jester for tonight, but we are doing a haunting rendition of the Fish of Blue Valley afterward." "Not the Fish of Blue Valley," Sybil squealed. "That was always one of my favorite pantomimes as a girl." "Well, you're in luck," the squire replied. "Or not," I warned as I glanced at Sybil. I bent down so that I was on the short man's level and gave him my most urgent look. I saw his eyes widen in response, and he grabbed at his hat like he might pull it from his head. "Is everything all right, Hank?" he asked as he patted the fabric instead. "Not exactly, Sebastian," I said. "Do you know if the king has arrived yet?" "He will be in his quarters," the small squire replied with a nod, and when he did so his hat jingled. "But might I ask, is this something to do with the matter of the cipher?" "I'm afraid it's exactly that," I said inside. "We found something disturbing in the pages, something that suggests the king is in danger. I need to talk to him immediately." "I'm afraid you will have to wait until after the sacred ceremony," the squire replied matter-of-factly. "The king can't be interrupted during his preparations for the ritual." "You don't understand," I interrupted. "This is a matter of life and death. In fact, the entire fate of the kingdom is at risk. The king has to be warned." "Oh, come now," the small squire laughed. "You're new, so I can understand if you don't know the rules about the sacred festival at Lake Wahaya. All of our problems in the kingdom are left in the palace. Matters of politics, quests, infighting affairs, all matters of drama are left at the bottom of the mountain." "You don't understand," I growled. "The vampires have a plan." "That vampires always have a plan," the little man said and rolled his eyes. "It's certainly nothing that would require breaking the sacred ritual." I growled again, and though Sebastian backed up a couple of steps, he didn't suddenly offer to take me to the king. I glanced at the girls in frustration, and while Sybil shrugged, I saw Tabitha scan the crowd. "Look," the noblewoman exclaimed, and pointed to a stall selling shining silver figurines of fish and other lake creatures. "It's Charles." I looked past the squire and saw Charles in his hybrid form making small talk with one of the merchants. The other knight was smiling as he examined some of the figures, and I felt a twinge of guilt that I was about to ruin his holiday. But Charles would listen to me, and he would help me get into the king's presence. "Come on," I urged the girls as I tried to dart across the square. "But," I heard Sebastian protest as we scurried off. Unfortunately, we didn't have time for pleasantries. I had only one reason for being here, and that was to rescue the king from Wendroth's evil plan. I ran up to Charles, who was leaning over a small display of manatee-like creatures. Before I could say his name, he glanced up and then jumped back slightly when he realized how close I was. "Good goddess," the older knight chuckled. "You gave me quite a start. But what a lovely surprise to see you all here. To be honest, I didn't think you would make it." "Neither did we," Tabitha said. "We must have set a world record to get here." "Is everything all right?" the noble knight asked as he scanned our faces. "Ah, should we go somewhere to talk in private?" "That would be wise," I replied, and I gestured at the women to follow us. We passed through what seemed to be an ever-growing sea of people in the market square. They were punctuated by tiny 4-foot squires who were all dressed like sea creatures. "They're doing the Fish of the Blue Valley again," he sighed. "Not like they do that one every single year with different costumes. They need to put another squire in charge of the program because Dromgool is such a perfectionist that he won't stop staging this one until it's absolutely perfect." "Sounds like Stanley Kubrick," Tabitha added before she realized what she'd said. "Sorry, Stanley who?" Charles asked with a bemused expression on his wolf face. Nothing, I said. Is this where you wanted to take us? I pointed to a small, 8-sided gazebo right outside the market square, which was just out of earshot of the crowds in the village. Yes, of course, perfect, he said and shook his head. He ushered us to the benches and then he sat down next to me. He gave me a hard stare while he waited for me to explain. I need to get to the king, I said. I need to warn him about the plan we've uncovered. Can you tell me what his schedule is for today? I just need a few minutes to talk to him. Charles looked slightly affronted by the flurry of information and questions, but he was wise and perceptive to realize that there was something genuinely wrong. Let's start with the first step, he said. The king is due to take a dip in Lake Wahaya at midnight, as is the tradition every year. He receives a blessing from the moon goddess that will determine how our crops will grow for the next year. This blessing is essential because it ensures that the kingdom will be able to survive until the next moon festival. I shot a look at Tabitha and Sybil, who stared back at me with a worried look on their faces. Yes, I've been told about the ritual, I replied, but he can't do it. It's too dangerous. What are you talking about? The other knight replied. Do you think he's going to drown or something? The king has done this every year since he assumed the throne. There's nothing dangerous about it. Look, I said. Here's the thing. What if I told you that there was a scheme to kill the king, and that it had been planned for years in advance to take place on this very day? Charles stared at me blankly before he sighed and turned to watch the gathered nobles for a moment. I understand that you're quite a new knight, and that your first quests have been turbulent, he said as he turned back to me. And maybe you have uncovered something while you were questing, but you must understand this. This ceremony is very important to the welfare of Lupercalia. You say you've uncovered some elaborate plot, but if the king doesn't complete the ritual, the whole country will suffer. We've been on a mission for days now, Tabitha insisted. That's why we weren't on the pilgrimage with the rest of the nobility. We had to find a cipher so we could decode the notebook. Hank, tell him about the notebook. Charles studied my face and I could tell that he was torn because he'd always been my mentor. But news like this would obviously make him question my sanity, even if I was chosen by the moon goddess. I know it sounds crazy, I said and took a deep breath. But it's the truth. When I defeated Wendroth, I found a journal with a bunch of strange writing in it. It was written in some sort of code, so I had to find a cipher who could figure out what it said. But there's no cipher in the palace anymore, Charles said. Not since Melchior. We found Melchior, Sybil cut in. He lives on an island in River Gomel west of Yerrick. Charles turned around slowly, and his eyes widened as he studied the witch. You found Melchior? He asked. But the king said that he went missing all those years ago. He didn't go missing, Tabitha said with some scorn in her voice. He abandoned his post. He didn't want to be involved in state secrets anymore. Well, Charles laughed. That's one way to retire. But if you're fortunate to be of the Lupercalian nobility, then by the goddess you would hold on to that post. Leave it to a red blood to just disappear because he didn't like doing the work anymore. Oh, no offense, Hank. That's what I thought, Tabitha agreed. At first I didn't like the cipher. But he's very good at what he does, Charles. He decoded all of the vampires writing through alchemy. Without him we wouldn't know what was going on. Charles looked between the three of us and sighed. Well, he said. What is going on? There's a plan, I said, that the vampires have been developing for years. They've been tracking the king's every movement when he leaves the palace, right down to the exact second he leaves the grounds and the second he returns. Everything he does outside the palace has been watched and recorded. That's, Charles began and stopped. I'm not really sure how to even finish that sentence. But that's not the end of it, I continued. They're experimenting with necromancy. They made a plan to put something in Lake Wahaya tonight. It's a kind of zombie, and it's made up of parts of old questing knights. Doesn't have to breathe, and that's why it can survive under the water. When the king goes to dip himself in the lake, the zombie is going to pull him under the water and kill him. I could barely believe what I was saying either. In comparison to my life in New Jersey, which seemed to be an endless flurry of business calls and emails, this talk about evil zombies sent by vampires didn't seem like it could be real. But it was real, and by the goddess we had to destroy the zombie before could fulfill its mission. Charles looked at me blankly before taking an almost pitiful breath in. All right, he said in a soft, almost fatherly tone of voice. First of all, I am more than impressed that you found Melchior. I always had a feeling that his random disappearance was not so random, and that there was something that perhaps only the king and the administrators of the palace knew about. Charles paused and stared at the wooden slats that made up the floor of the gazebo. For a second, an awkward silence fell on the four of us. But, Tabitha finally asked. Sorry, Charles said brusquely and shook his head. I was just thinking. You can understand why this is a lot of information to take in. And to have all this happen on such an important day is, well, it's a bit difficult to decide what to do. Of course, I replied. And believe me, I wouldn't be here if I wasn't sure. But I know in my gut that the vampires are planning to strike tonight. I don't doubt you, Charles said softly. I don't doubt a word of what you just told me. The only thing is, this is more than just a holiday. Our country's fortunes rest on this ritual. To interrupt it on a suspicion? That's a lot to ask. I took a deep breath and looked over at Tabitha, who was practically on the edge of her seat. Charles, the noblewoman said, you know that I understand the importance of this ritual, not just for the Lupercalian nobility but for the entire kingdom. I've been coming here my whole life, but I saw the notebook and I believe what the cipher told us. It all makes sense, and today is the day that they're going to try and carry out their plan. If we don't do something, then the vampires will win. Charles stared at the slats a moment longer, sighed deeply, and finally folded his hands together. He sat up straight and looked at all of us. All right, he said. As much as it pains me to interfere in such an important ceremony, I believe you. Hank was chosen by the moon goddess, after all. Then you'll help us? I pressed. Charles studied the nobles in the square again before he finally nodded. He sighed and ran a hand through his hair. You three know more of the details of the vampire's plan, he said. So I don't know that there's much I can add to your mission. But, Sybil started to protest until Tabitha tapped her arm. You know where he's staying, Tabitha said. You always were much quicker at solving puzzles than your peers, Charles chuckled. And yes, I know where the king is residing. You're a lifesaver, Charles, I said. Literally. Don't thank me yet, he chided. You'll still have to find a way to get in. To see him. We can do that, I assured him. Follow the main road north, he said as he pointed toward the road we'd used to enter the town. With your wolf senses, you'll soon pick up the scent of the lake. There's a path that leads into the hills, just before the road curves back down toward the valley. The path may not look like much, but it will take you to the royal compound. How can we be sure we've found the right place? Sybil asked. You'll know, the knight laughed. It's quite large and glows white in the sunlight. That sounds easy enough, I said. So what's the catch? Sybil asked. The catch, he sighed, is that I can't think of a single reason the guards would let you in. You can try, but they are under orders to keep everyone away until the ritual is over. The only people who are allowed in the royal compound during the moon ceremony are the royal family. There are no outsiders whatsoever. And there's a chance we could be kicked out of the palace forever if we trespass, Tabitha added. My father would never ever live that sort of thing down. Yes, Charles agreed with a nod. But worse than that, the king would have no choice but to banish you if you interrupt the ceremony. That seems a bit extreme just for a dip in the lake, I replied. You still don't understand, Charles sighed. By interrupting the ritual, you endanger not just the king, but the entire kingdom. I realized that the stakes were higher than ever, but I almost didn't care. I knew what the cipher had told us, and I remembered Wenderoth's evil threat. When he hissed his last words, I had no doubt in my mind that we were doing the right thing. Don't worry, Tabitha, I said. There's no chance we're going to get kicked out. I remember the look on Wenderoth's face when he died. It's been haunting me ever since the quest to the Obsidian Temple, and this is my chance to defeat him once and for all. Tabitha looked up at me, and her soft brown eyes glowed in the late afternoon sunlight. I know, Hank, she said. Don't worry. I trust you, and I trust the cipher, too. We're going to have to warn the king, whether it's against royal protocol or not. Tabitha stood up defiantly, and the mountain breeze blew through her platinum blonde hair. She was a warrior at heart, and nothing was going to stop her. from defending her kingdom, even if it meant that she could be banished from her home. I trust you, Charles said. But by the goddess, you better succeed. If there is no threat in the water, well, I suppose you could always return to New Jersey. I'm right, I said. And I don't plan on leaving Lupercalia just yet. Good, he said, and a faint smile formed on his lips. And now I must ask, how on earth did you get from your estate to Gomel here in under a week? That's unheard of. I wanted to tell him about the journeys we'd taken across the entire length of Lupercalia. I wanted to tell him that we'd practically crossed the space-time continuum by traveling to New Jersey and back, but there was simply no way to explain it. I looked over at Sybil, who had blushed a deep pink color. When she fluttered her eyelashes at me, I decided to at least see that she got credit for her part. Sybil made a potion that helped me run faster, I said. She's really becoming a master alchemist. Well, he said as he glanced at Sybil, that is certainly an advantage as a questing knight. It wasn't just me, Sybil replied. Tabitha found routes that weren't even on the official Lupercalian maps. It sounds like you three are becoming quite the team, Charles said and smiled. Most young knights don't understand how important that is. I'd never have made it this far without them, I said and stood up. But now, we have one more mission to complete. May the goddess bless you, Charles said as the girls stood up. Come on, girls, I said. We waved goodbye to Charles and then ran back to the main square. The place was even busier, which forced us to slow down. We picked our way through nobles dressed in white and blue tunics, who stood around carts of mead and plum wine, and little children who chased after the squires dressed like fish. I could understand why this pilgrimage to the mountains was a welcome reprieve from life in the palace. Of course the palace was beautiful, but it somehow felt smaller and more ordinary in comparison to the vast beauty of the mountains. The mountain air was cool and calm, and just like Charles said, I could smell something fresh in the distance. Wait, Tabitha called out. I looked behind me and saw that the blonde had her hands on her knees and she was breathing heavily. Are you okay? I asked as I walked over to her. I suddenly felt lightheaded, the noblewoman said without looking up. Ooh, Sybil exclaimed as she pointed to a large fire where they were roasting various kinds of fish. Can we get a snack? Please, oh please. It was still only late afternoon, and the official ceremony wasn't until midnight. We were all famished from the trip over, and I had a pretty strong feeling that there would be fighting ahead. Without some food to revive us, we'd be no use to anyone. It does smell good, the blonde said as she stood up. And I'm sure I'll feel better once I eat something. It's a long line, I noted. Oh, I can take care of that, Tabitha said with a wink. And don't worry, we'll get you some too. Fine, I sighed. Tabitha and Sybil scurried over to the roaring fire and somehow sweet-talked their way to the head of the line, where they procured 3 servings of the fish after a short discussion with one of the cooks. They then waded back to me with polite smiles plastered on their faces, though I did see the pair use their elbows more than once to clear a path. Did you see that? Tabitha asked. I'd say we did that in what? 3 minutes flat? Another speed record for Team Hank. I think we might have caused some damage on the way though, Sybil sighed, and nodded toward a group of young nobles. One of the hybrids was wiping plum wine from his tunic, and he shot an angry glare at Sybil and Tabitha. It took me a moment, but I recognized the werewolf as Hector. Figures, I sighed. He deserved it, Tabitha replied. He tried to block our path and ask us questions. And you did say to be quick, Sybil said. That I did, I said with a grin. So what did you pick up for me? Trout, they said in unison and handed me one of the plates. It smells delicious, I replied as I took a deep breath. I looked around and saw that a lot of the nobility were feasting in their hybrid forms. I remembered that it wasn't traditional in the palace, but people seemed to be letting loose here, so I held my fish by the tip of the tail and plopped the whole thing down my gullet just like the other hybrids were doing. I chewed it effortlessly, bones and all, and swallowed the delicious fish. There were hints of lemon and black pepper, and it was so fresh that it didn't need any more seasoning than that. Best of all, it tamed the hunger that running so many miles had inspired in me. Now that was impressive, Tabitha said. I wish I could do that. Your approach to beer isn't too far off, I teased her. Oh, stop, she exclaimed and turned a bright rose pink. This is so good, Sybil said as she munched on the fish. We never had much fish when I was little because it's so expensive to import into stock. Well, that makes one of us, Tabitha said, and she greedily took a bite out the center of one of the fish. I practically got sick of the stuff when I was younger. Sybil rolled her eyes at the noblewoman and then speared her fish with a fork. The witch popped a very large piece into her mouth and purred happily. Hey Tabitha, I asked. What's the noble consensus on eating while standing up? She raised her eyebrows and widened her eyes. Then she pulled another fish bone out of her mouth and looked up at me. Unheard of, she said and shook her head. In fact, this is the only place where the nobility can be found either eating in their hybrid form or eating standing up. If I had been caught doing that as a child, I would have been made to recite the chivalric code while being held upside down. She took a final forkful of fish, and I looked down at the plate. By now there was nothing left but the head and the tail. Well, that was a success, I said and wiped my mouth with my hybrid hand. I knew that such a gesture would never fly in the castle, but here it felt like anything was allowed. Well, almost anything. Somehow I didn't think the ruckus we were about to cause at the royal household would be quite so easy to overlook. I'll take the plates back, Sybil said and then disappeared back into the crowd with our empty plates and forks. I needed that, Tabitha said happily. I feel like I'm ready to tackle anything. But we should leave soon. My parents are here somewhere, and if they corner us, we'll be stuck here until next year. It's getting late, I said as I glanced at the sky. And I'd rather get there before dark. The sun was beginning to glow orange, which cast a beautiful light over the market square. Every stone and bit of glass shimmered with a golden aura, and the scent of the woodfire mingled with pine and wildflower to create an intoxicating aroma. It was easy to see why this place was the site of a sacred ceremony. We have to get going, Sybil said when she reappeared. The pantomime is going to start soon, and they tried to usher me into the outdoor theater. Said that I was going to be sick, so they let me leave, but that's where everyone is expected to be. If they catch us out here, they'll wonder what we're up to. Then let's get going, I said. The crowd in the square was definitely thinning out as people started to file into the theater. There were still a few people lingering in the square, though, so we ambled among the nobles until we reached the edge of the square. And then we darted along the cobbled road toward the hills. No one called after us, so we slowed to a walk once we cleared the last building. The road was wide and provided a stunning view of the valley below, and if we hadn't been on our way to save the king, I would have stopped and enjoyed the scene. I can smell the lake clearly now, I said. We must be close. The road dips ahead, Tabitha said. Keep an eye out for the path. There, I said as I spotted a small break on the left side of the road. That must be it. It doesn't look like the path to a royal residence, Sybil remarked. I think that's the point, I chuckled. Once we were out of sight of the road, the dirt path became another cobbled pathway with wide steps and even a banister to help in the steeper areas. Wasn't exactly a backbreaking hike, but it was still steep enough that I could feel it in my thighs. This is pretty steep, Sybil huffed. I think we're close though, Tabitha replied. I found this old map of the area. Hank, is everything okay? I had stopped in the middle of the path, and the girls had kept going for a few steps before they realized I was no longer next to them. The pair turned to look at me, and while they looked puzzled, I was happy to see that they didn't look worried or afraid. Yeah, I replied. Just a moment. I stuck my wolf nose in the air and took a deep breath. The pure water smell was stronger than before, and it seemed to want to lead me deeper into the forest. What is it? Tabitha asked. Just smelling our way to the lake, I laughed. As you said, we're not too far now. I sprang ahead and the girls ran after me. You know what this kind of reminds me of? Sybil said between puffs. No, I don't, Tabitha huffed. What does it remind you of? Our house in New Jersey on Pennington Drive, the witch replied. What makes you say that? I asked. Oh, you know, Sybil said. Secluded woodland mansion that isn't visible to the general public. I don't know what the king's quarters look like, but I bet they're really nice. Maybe not as nice as ours, but nice. Oh, I'd say it was pretty close, I said as the royal residence came into view. We stopped at the edge of the clearing and stared at the gleaming compound that had been built on the very edge of the lake. First it seemed like a very simple design, with a square base and round dome over the center. But as I looked more closely, I could see the designs that had been carved into the marble around the top edge, the seamless connections between the slabs, and of course the brilliant white light that seemed to light up the area like a second sun. I could just see the lake beyond the house, and it was truly an inspirational sight. The lake spread out for a few miles into the distance as clear and still as a mirror. The sky, the trees, and the massive home were all perfectly reflected on the surface, though I shivered when I remembered what was probably hiding in its depths. Whoa, Sybil as she stared wide-eyed at the scene. You know, Tabitha said as she stared at the marble house, I've seen a lot of beautiful places in my life, but nothing quite like that. In fact, I almost feel like I'm doing something wrong just by looking at it. Me too, I said. The effect of the lake swaying behind it made me feel like the compound was more of a mirage than anything, a trick that the light was playing on us, and that if I reached out and tried to touch it, the whole place would disappear. Shit, I muttered out of habit when I spotted the two hybrid guards who were on duty. They stood on either side of the door in front of two giant square columns. Their silver armor glinted orange in the evening light, and even the blue capes that flowed down their backs looked more yellow as the sun descended. Neither had reacted to our appearance yet, which I hoped meant they hadn't spotted us yet, but with the guards it was hard to be sure. Not that it mattered, since we would have to talk to the hybrids anyway, but I'd sort of hoped we'd at least be able to knock on the door before someone chased us away. There's the guards, Tabitha sighed. Only the bane of my existence since I was 13 years old. No, it's good, I replied. Not only are you an excellent navigator, but you're also going to be our resident sweet talker. I saw how quickly you managed to move to the front of the line. Sybil snickered. You know something, Hank? Tabitha replied. I think that might just be the job I was born to do. I have complete faith in you, I said. And now all you have to do is convince those guards to let us inside before nightfall. If not, we'll have to come up with another plan, preferably one that doesn't involve fighting the guards. Are you ready? Ready as ever, Tabitha nodded. Good, I replied. Let's go save Lupercalia.